Alright, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and as part of the Rankin Technical College AWD, or Application Website Development Program, and in particular the AWD 1111 .NET Framework with Web Databases class, I am doing a series of video presentations based on the textbook we'll be using for this class for the fall 2019 semester. The textbook, as you can see on your screen, is ProASP.NET MVC 5. It's an 8-press text by Adam Freeman, and we're working our way through Chapter 15 of 27. And I left off on the middle of page 407 talking about using attribute routing. The authors mention here in this paragraph right here, all the examples we've seen thus far in the chapter have been defined using a technique known as convention-based routing. MVC adds support for a new technique starting with MVC 5 that's called attribute routing, in which routes are defined by C# attributes that are applied directly to the controller classes. So for the rest of the chapter, we're going to show how to create and configure routes using attributes, which can be mixed freely with what we talked about earlier. All right. Again, attribute routing is one of the major additions to MVC 5, but the author doesn't like it because he thinks it breaks the separation of concerns principle. I don't know enough about it to say whether I agree or disagree with him. Attribute routing is disabled by default and enabled by the map MVC attribute routes extension method, which is called on the route collection object passed to the argument to the static register routes method. All right. So what the author has done is to come in here and in the register routes and let's go into our route config and let's comment out that one, and we're going to remove this one here that we just are commenting out, the one I tried putting in fairly unsuccessfully. Calling the map MVC routes, which is again what we just put in or what we would put in right here. In fact, let me just get rid of all this. It's getting very confusing to read. All right. So again, in our register routes, the author is saying that we can come in and add this line of code. Okay. It causes the routing system to inspect the controller classes in the application and look for attributes that configure routes. The most important attribute is called route, and if we look in our customer controller, the author wants us to come in here and near the top, right before our index method, wants us to add this. This is the basic use of the route method, which is to define a static route for the action method. The route defines two properties as are shown in the text on page 409. A name property, as it says, it assigns a name to the route used for generating outgoing URLs from a specific route, and a template, all right, which defines the pattern that will be used to match URLs that target the action method. If we supply just one value when applying the route attribute, then the value is assumed to be the pattern that will be used to match the routes. Let's come in. I have no idea if this is going to work with all the stuff I've added and removed. So let's do a save all and run it. Once it comes up, the author wants us to just, after here, no home, no nothing, just put the word test in here. when this eventually comes up. And if it works, it should come up and say the controller is customer and the action is index. What we've just done is referred to as decorating the action method with the route attribute. Once you do that, it can no longer be accessed through the convention ways of doing it. That means you can no longer, well, we did get an error. All right. All it would mean was, if we put this in, we can say /test. But if we try to say /customer/index, it would no longer work. All right. 410, creating routes with segment values. The attribute routing feature supports all the same features as convention-based routing, albeit expressed through attributes. We show an example right here. It says this includes creating routes that contain segment variables, and that's an example. Where here we'd expect 1, 2, 3, 4. All right. All right, I'm going to jump down to the bottom of page 412, whoops, which talks about combining constraints. And as the author says, you can apply multiple constraints to a segment variable to further restrict the range of values that the route will match. In the example that the author will show on here on page 413, we've combined the alpha and length constraints for this change pass method. Multiple constraints can be chained together using the same format for a single constraint. Finally, this is one of the longer chapters in the text. You can use the route prefix attribute to define a common prefix that will be applied to all routes defined in a controller. This can be useful when you have multiple actions that should be targeted using the same URL route. So the author has done that here, and then going on to the top of the next page. He says, I use the route prefix attribute to specify that the routes for the action method should be prefixed with users. Prefixing the URL with // tells the framework that we don't want the route prefix attribute applied to the index action method. All right? That was it for this chapter. As you can see, the author says here, in this chapter, we really did take kind of a deep dive into the routing system. All right? Some of the stuff worked just fine and is as shown. Some of the rest of it was a bit problematic. In Chapter 16, which is the next chapter and a little shorter than this one, we'll show how to generate outgoing URLs from routes and views and how to use the MVC framework areas feature. What areas does is it allows you to better manage large and complex applications in a way by turning them into mini projects. That's not well put, but that's the way that I'll leave it at the end of this particular lesson.